Good evening. My name is Toby Petroselli, and this evening we're going to talk about Stamford, Connecticut. This semester, my team and I worked with them in finding ways to protect its beaches from damaging coastal storms, and our faculty advisor was George Sarrinikolaou. In this presentation, I will discuss the threat that storms pose to the sustainability of Stamford's beach parks. Then I will explain why it's difficult to protect those beaches, and finally I will describe how we did our analysis and came to a solution for Stamford. Now this is an amateur video that was of Stamford, Connecticut. Hurricane Sandy is ravaging one of Stamford's beach parks. The storm is creating a quite powerful surge with strong waves hitting into its existing seawall. The surge is so high that it is flooding the park behind the beach. And when this water finally recedes, acres of parkland will be covered in sand knee-deep. And this same thing happened just the year before during Hurricane Irene. Now this is the aftermath of that storm. It cost Stamford a lot of money to clean up after these damaging storms, almost $1 million. The city has to scoop up all of the sand, clean it, screen it for any debris, and then put it all back on the beach. It also has to repair damage to park facilities and infrastructure. As you can see here, the flooding lifted the pavement, destroying its existing parking lots. The seawall you saw earlier in that video is in crumble on the upper left. That happened during Irene and during Sandy. And all of this leads to Stamford's beach parks being closed for months at a time. When we first took on the project, we assumed, as did our client, that beaches could be protected. We reviewed numerous technologies, as shown here. We thought that the solution to Stamford's problem would be finding the right engineering technology, the best way to keep the water back and the sand in place. But we were wrong. Protecting beaches from big storms is quite difficult, and it turns out that beach protection is just a short-term fix. The coastline of the city of Stamford is already vulnerable to large storms. That's what this map shows, and that's what Hurricane Sandy showed all of us. Now consider 30 years from now, the chance of a hurricane occurring in any single year is predicted to double. And when these storms do hit Stamford, even the smaller ones, they will bring higher floodwaters and much stronger storms than they do today. This is because we are headed into a future of rising sea levels and more intense coastal storms. The future will be very different than it is today. Now, it took a major hurricane this past fall to relocate a layer of sand 2 feet deep, but 30 years from now, a small nor'easter may just do the trick. And under such conditions, beach protection likely will be difficult and expensive to maintain. So we faced a dilemma. We had to help Stamford protect its beaches now, but also prepare the city for the reality that beach protection may be impossible, or at least impractical, in the future. We knew that there are technologies that could reduce damage and minimize cleanup costs today, but we understood that these might not work years from now. So to reconcile Stamford's goals with future realities, we had to look beyond engineering solutions, and instead, we reframed the problem about managing risk over time. Now, by taking a risk management approach, the city would invest in beach protection today. This way, it would reduce damage after the next storm. But the city would also have to build in the flexibility to change its strategy over time. It would monitor how its beach protection measures performed, it would track climate forecast, and then Stamford could decide whether to spend money on beach protection or to find a different way to deal with these storms. We evaluated numerous beach protection options with the goal of managing risk across time, and for each of these, we considered the following criteria. First, is this technology feasible? As you can see on the left, those are floodgates. They are an outsized option, too costly for Stamford, much too expensive. Effectiveness, could this option truly work? Would it prevent storm surge from flooding the parks and preventing sand and damage? Technologies like beach dewatering systems and salt marshes don't quite do the job. Now, flexibility is another. Would this technology allow the city to change its strategy over time? Perhaps be built in stages to avoid making one large initial capital investment? And could this option perhaps be modified later on? Hard engineering technologies like the seawall you saw earlier in the video, or bulkheads, as you can see here, are not flexible. Once they're built, they stay there for long periods of time. We also analyzed benefits. Does this technology offer additional advantages that would enhance the investment? For instance, animal habitats, better water quality, maybe even a better looking beach. Jetties, for example, don't offer any of these advantages. And finally, we considered cost effectiveness. Is this technology worth implementing? Is it a sound investment? It turned out that none of our technologies, unfortunately, that we evaluated were cost effective, and I will come back to that in just a moment. So the best technology for Stamford at this point in the short term has two parts. First, we recommend building a vegetated sand dune, which is shown here. We recommend that these dunes be built using geotextile tubes. Dunes with geotextile tubes look like natural sand dunes from the outside, but they have a durable structure on the inside. The structures are made from a special fabric that is filled with sand. And the purpose of them, of course, is to make the dune stronger and more resistant to storm damage. When the storm surge is high and the waves are pounding against these dunes, wave energy absorbs and it does reduce flooding overall. In dunes with geotextile tubes, only the outside layer of this will be washed away and the inner structure will remain. Now, another option to build a dune is to make it a simple vegetated dune with no inner structure. This type of dune is not quite as durable, but it does offer flexibility in the long term, and it costs less. Now, second, we also reviewed to reduce exposure. We recommend that the city reduce the storm damage behind the dunes. We suggest that Stamford develop a plan to flood-proof its buildings in the park, perhaps move them farther away or elevate them on stilts, as you can see here. We also recommend using materials and landscaping that would fare better during coastal flooding. Now let's return to cost for a moment. Now this graph shows that investing in beach protection doesn't pay. If you compare the value of doing nothing over a span of 30 years to building a dune, Stamford would still be dipping into their pockets after the next big storm, and they'll still be making those repairs of those damages. But if they do build the dune, they still will be further in the red. And what we have to keep in mind, though, is that there's a 30% chance that Stamford will get a storm in the next 30 years. And when that storm does hit, the cleanup will be another $1 million for Stamford. And building this dune will simply reduce that price tag, and ultimately Stamford must approach the matter by considering the future risk to these beach parks. So the dunes may not sound like the best investment, but there's more to consider than money and loan. There are pros and cons to investing in this technology. Stamford may deem it valuable to build the dunes to avoid closing its parks for long periods of time, perhaps to lessen the shock that comes with storm damage. This technology also lowers the cleanup cost. We know the city has a strong interest in this. And building dunes also offers Stamford an opportunity to introduce the idea of climate risk to its community. Now, on the other hand, the technology requires a large initial capital investment and has associated maintenance cost as well. It's also important to understand that the dune does reduce risk, although it doesn't certainly eliminate it. And a key consideration, of course, is that these dunes only provide a short-term solution. And finally, dunes would block the view of the ocean from the parking lot. We were told that Stamford values sitting in their car, looking out to the Long Island Sound, gorgeous view. So at the end of the day, Stamford must consider the long-term reality. The sand on the beaches move all the time. With higher sea levels and more coastal storms, the sand on these beaches will move inland. And over the next century, Stamford's beaches will be in a different place than they are today. Hurricane Sandy gave us a preview of this just last November, and essentially a preview of the potential future. The storm moved the beach entirely to the Great Lawn, as you can see here. Now, such a drastic change would mean rethinking what these parks are and how they are used. On the left is a current landscape of Cove Island Park. And we cannot be sure what will happen 90 years from now, but we know that if the climate scientists are right, the water and the sand may overtake today's existing beach parks. And at this point, beach protection will have become just too expensive. And the people of Stamford will still go to the beach, they just may have to get there some other way. And they may be sitting on beaches that look very different from those that our parents or our grandparents once visited. But herein lies an opportunity for Stamford, Connecticut, to balance their long-term realities and the short-term solution, so to afford a sustainable future. And that's all I have for today. Thank you so much. If you have any questions.
I guess I have two questions. On your economic analysis, if you invest in the protection today, and your impacts are 10 years in the future and the dollars are inflated, did you consider those factors? And secondly, what is the economic impact of the park or the beach park on the town? And did you include the economic impact of not having those activities if the beach was eliminated?
Well, we did consider the beach parks being closed, although Stamford doesn't, I guess they don't have a large income from the residents. It's not a big income producing park. As far as discounting the dollars over 10 years, we've looked at this really in a short-term sense to understand that a dune is only going to reduce the damages overall. It's never going to ultimately, it would take 200 years for them to really recoup that investment if you discounted it over time. So you can't really look at it that way. You have to look at it more as something where...
What I mean is that the impacts, I'm sorry, the price of the impacts are in the future, and the cost of the protection is in the present.
Right.
And so it's sort of like building the New York subway system. We could never build it today, or the water system, but we're benefiting from it. So if the benefits come in the future, the dollars are different than when you invest it in the present. I just was wondering if you included that kind of analysis in your analysis.
Yes, we did. We did consider that. We did consider that for sure. We tried. It's expensive. It would have cost them $2 million to build these dunes if they do decide to go through with it. So, and it's $1 million of damage. So it's a tough comparison, to be honest. Yes.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. I just wanted to find out, had you presented this to your client at all yet, or obviously some of this information, and if so, what was their response? Thank you.
We have not. Friday morning is the presentation. Although it seems to us that they're very interested in doing something today. The community is interested in seeing something. This happened 2 years in a row, so they're really feeling the effects. They want to see something done. So I think dunes might be in their near future for them.
Thank you very much. Very, very nice presentation. I have a follow-up question to the previous one. Did you make a stakeholder analysis? Who are the beneficiaries? Most of them. Is it the city, or is it social groups who benefit more? And who are who are paying and who are receiving from the investment? And are there some interests behind pushing this?
The main interest is the town, it's the community. There aren't really a stakeholder, or there's not separate groups that are advocating for anything. We didn't really consider that as much, but it's really coming from the planning board in the town.
Time for one last question. Mark, got a question?
I'm just curious where you benchmarked. The U.S. has quite a bit of coastline, and hurricane hit more towns than just Sandy. So, what other solutions at this town, state, or federal level did you look at when coming up with your analysis and recommendations?
Mainly, we were specific to Stamford, so we didn't really look at other areas. Although I think that any of these solutions, or the way we went about this, looking at the risk and then assessing it, monitoring it over time, would definitely be applicable for other coastal cities. We understand that Stamford is going to receive some subsidies. FEMA's getting involved. I believe they're even interested in rebuilding that existing seawall because FEMA is willing to pay for just that to be put back on the beach, despite the fact that we don't recommend it. So there is that issue to contend with, and I guess on Friday when we do meet with them, we'll speak a little bit more to that effect. Thank you. Thank you.